There's a question that has haunted hearts for over 2,000 years, a question whispered in churches, debated by scholars, and quietly buried beneath tradition. What was the true purpose of Jesus? Not the one preached from pulpits or painted in stained glass, but the one that history almost forgot, the one that touches something deep within you, something that feels both sacred and unsettling. Because if you strip away religion, remove the layers of interpretation, and listen closely to the raw pulse of his story, you begin to realize that Jesus wasn't here simply to save souls. He was here to awaken something we've spent centuries trying to silence. Imagine for a moment that everything you've been told about divinity, the distance between heaven and earth, between you and God, was never real. That the entire mission of Jesus was not to create followers, but to remind you of a truth buried within your own being. A truth that threatens every structure built to contain it. His miracles, his parables, even his crucifixion, they were never random acts of holiness. They were symbols in a code designed to awaken human consciousness itself. But here's the secret few dare to speak. That awakening came with a price. Because once you see what he truly came to reveal, you can never see the world or yourself the same way again. What if his greatest message wasn't about belief, but about becoming? What if he wasn't showing us who he was, but who we are capable of being? The answer to that question may not comfort you, but it will change everything you thought you knew about God, love, and your own purpose. They say truth reveals itself not in thunder, but in whispers, and, if you listen closely, beneath the noise of sermons and centuries, you can still hear that whisper. It begins somewhere quiet, like the stillness before dawn, when the world hasn't yet remembered its own name. It's there that we meet him not as the distant, haloed figure of paintings, but as a man with dust on his feet and an ache in his heart. A man who saw through the veil of illusion that humanity had woven for itself. Before the crowds, before the miracles, before the crucifixion, Jesus walked as one who remembered something everyone else had forgotten, that the divine was not above us, but within us. In those early days, the people around him could sense it, though they couldn't explain it. There was something in his gaze mirror that showed them their own light and their own darkness all at once. Fishermen, tax collectors, outcasts, they weren't drawn to religion. They were drawn to recognition. Something ancient stirred when he spoke, as though the soul itself remembered it had once been infinite. And yet, the more they listened, the more they felt the quiet terror of awakening, the realization that to follow him wasn't to worship, but to change. He never asked for temples or rituals. His temple was the human heart. His altar, the moments of compassion that shattered indifference. When he said, "The kingdom of heaven is within you," he wasn't offering comfort, he was issuing a challenge. Because to look within is to confront every lie we've inherited about who we are and what we're capable of. And the world has always feared that kind of freedom. It's easier to build walls of doctrine than to face the boundless truth of the soul. There were nights he sat by the fire, alone, staring into the flickering flames. Those who passed by saw only a man lost in thought, but in truth, he was listening to something vast and wordless, a voice that spoke not in language, but in knowing. It told him that his mission would not be understood, that humanity, still blind with fear and hunger for control, would twist his words into chains instead of wings. And still, he said yes, because love in its truest form, always chooses to walk into the darkness, knowing it may not return. He began to teach in parables, not because he wanted to confuse, but because the truth cannot be swallowed whole. It must unfold gently, like dawn over the hills. Each story was a seed planted in the soil of human consciousness. Some would take root immediately, others would lie dormant for centuries. "Love your enemies," he said, and the words rippled across time like a prophecy. "Do good to those who hate you." Few understood that he wasn't just talking about moral virtue. He was describing the mechanics of spiritual evolution. Every act of love dissolves a fragment of the illusion that separates us. But as his light grew brighter, so did the shadows around him. The priests, the scholars, the powerful, they saw in him not salvation, but danger, because he was dismantling the entire framework upon which their authority rested. They needed people to feel small, to believe that access to the divine required permission. But he was showing them that God breathed through every human heartbeat, that no one needed an intermediary to touch eternity. To those addicted to control, that kind of truth was poison. Still, he walked among them, healing the sick, touching the untouchable, speaking to those the world had forgotten. Every miracle was more than mercy, it was revelation. When he restored sight to the blind, he wasn't only opening eyes of flesh, he was symbolically awakening the eyes of the soul. When he calmed the storm, he was teaching that even the chaos within us obeys the authority of awareness. These acts were metaphors made real, each one whispering the same message: you are not powerless. You never were. And yet, in the quiet moments between the crowds, he carried a heaviness that few could see, the awareness that the very system he sought to liberate would one day bear his symbol on its banners, that his message of oneness would be fractured into denominations and dogmas, that people would one day kill in his name, not realizing they were crucifying the very consciousness he came to awaken. Still, he didn't stop, because he understood something profound, that truth doesn't need to win. It only needs to be spoken. Its echo becomes eternal. Every time he forgave, every time he refused to hate, every time he chose compassion over pride, he was reprogramming humanity's collective soul, planting a vibration that would outlive empires. And perhaps that's the secret. We were never meant to forget that salvation isn't an event, it's an evolution, a remembering of what has always been true. And so, as the first chapter of his mission unfolded, something began to shift, not just in the people who followed him, but in the invisible architecture of consciousness itself. The veil thinned, the world trembled, and humanity, without knowing it, took its first step toward awakening. But awakening always comes with a cost, and the cost of truth is everything you once believed. There's a moment in every great revelation when the light becomes too bright for the world to bear. For Jesus, that moment came not as thunder or divine spectacle, but as the quiet widening of Isa. Instant, people began to sense that his message was not about obedience, but liberation. And liberation terrifies those who have built their kingdoms on control. As his words spread from dusty roads to crowded synagogues, they began to ignite something uncontrollable. Farmers, widows, and beggars, people the world had long ignored, they began to believe that their lives had divine weight, that they were not mere shadows in someone else's story, but vessels of the same creative power that birthed the stars. The authorities called it blasphemy, but he called it remembering. In the mornings, he would walk alone before the sun rose, listening to the earth breathe. He spoke often of seeds, not just because he understood the land, but because he understood the soul. Every human heart, he knew, was soil hard, stony, or fertile, depending on how much pain it had endured. And so he scattered words, like a farmer flinging hope into wind. The kingdom is like a mustard seed, he said, and smiled faintly. The smallness of it was the point. Greatness, he knew, begins in the unseen. But the more people awakened, the more the system resisted. The priests gathered in secret chambers, their whispers echoing off the cold stone walls. They argued about doctrine, about law, about how to silence a man who spoke of love as if it were a revolution. If the people believe they carry God within them, one said, then what use will they have for us? They didn't fear his miracles, they feared his message, because a miracle could be denied. But an idea that touches the human spirit becomes unstoppable and still. Jesus spoke. He told them that the law was not wrong, but incomplete, that God's justice was not punishment but mercy in disguise, that sin was not a stain, but a forgetting of one's own light. Every word he spoke tore at the veil of separation, and for that he became both adored and hunted. Crowds followed him, but few understood that his path was not toward glory, it was toward surrender. He knew the cross long before he saw it. He carried its shadow quietly in his soul, not as a burden, but as a reminder that the awakening of mankind would always demand sacrifice. One evening, he sat by the Sea of Galilee, the water reflecting the fading gold of the sun. His closest followers were silent, their eyes fixed on him, waiting for answers. But instead of teaching, he asked a question. Who do you say that I am? They hesitated. Some said teacher, others said prophet. Peter, trembling, whispered, You are the Son of the living God. Jesus looked at him not with pride, but with sorrowful tenderness. Blessed are you, he said, for flesh and blood did not reveal this to you. But even now you do not understand. The Son of Man is not one but many. It is the divine spark within all who awaken. The words hung in the air like sacred fire. They would not grasp their meaning until much later, until his absence forced them to look inward and see that he had never left. Night after night, he spoke of the heart as the only true temple, of love as the only law that mattered. But love, in its rawest form, demands that one relinquish control, pride, and even certainty. And that is why so many turned away. They wanted a Messiah who would conquer their enemies, not one who would dissolve the illusion of enmity itself. They wanted freedom without transformation, heaven without humility. Still, he never judged them. Instead, he looked upon their confusion with the same compassion he offered to the broken and the blind. He saw that the world had been conditioned to fear its own divinity, to believe that suffering was virtue and joy was sin. His mission was to rewrite that story. But to do so, he would have to face the one truth no one else could, that enlightenment cannot be taught, embodied and demonstrated through love that refuses to die, even in the face of death itself. In the final days before his arrest, he began to speak more in silence than in words. His eyes carried a knowing that unsettled even his disciples. There were moments when he seemed almost distant, as if listening to something beyond the veil of time itself. Perhaps he already heard the sound of hammers in the distance, or the trembling prayers of those who would betray him out of fear. Yet there was no anger in him, only an infinite stillness, because he understood that betrayal, like suffering, is part of awakening. The seed must crack before it can rise, and when Judas kissed him in the garden, he did not resist. He looked at him as one might look at a brother who has forgotten his own soul. "Do what you came for," he said, softly, not as condemnation, but as acceptance. For even betrayal, he knew, was swallowed by love in the end. And so began the descent, the part of the story most have misunderstood. The crucifixion, to him, was never a punishment. It was a mirror, the divine demonstrating that even in agony, the soul remains untouchable. That love, when realized as truth, transcends body, death, and time itself. Humanity saw tragedy. He saw liberation. He was not dying for humanity. He was dying as humanity, to show that the eternal cannot be destroyed. And somewhere deep within every soul that watched him fall, something ancient stirred. Not pity, but recognition. Because on that hill, under the bleeding sky, we were not witnessing the death of a man. We were witnessing the birth of a new consciousness. There are moments in human history when silence itself becomes sacred. After the cross was raised, after the cries faded into the dusk, after the crowd dispersed in uneasy quiet, there was such a silence. It hung heavy over Jerusalem, like the breath between death and resurrection. The world didn't know it yet, but something irreversible had happened, not in the realm of flesh, but in the unseen corridors of consciousness. The veil had been torn not as an act of destruction, but of revelation. For in that stillness, humanity stood naked before its own divinity. The disciples were broken, scattered like ashes on the wind. Fear had devoured the very men who once walked beside him. Peter wept in alleys, his faith bleeding through trembling hands. Mary sat in shadows, staring at the empty space where his voice used to echo. They all asked the same question, whispered through tears and disbelief. Was it all for nothing? But while grief swallowed the city, something began to stir beyond comprehension. Not the return of a man in flesh, but the rising of an idea that could never die. The resurrection was never about the reanimation of a body, was about the awakening of a consciousness. Jesus had not come to conquer death. He came to show that it had never held power in the first place. He had entered the depths of despair to prove that even in the darkest silence, love remained unbroken. In the unseen realm, he stood not as the figure of suffering, but as light itself, brilliant, vast, formless. The same voice that once spoke through parables now pulsed through the hearts of all who still believed. He was not gone. He had become within, and those who listened closely enough could feel it, the flicker of eternity igniting in their own souls. For the true resurrection was not his, but ours. When the stone was rolled away, it wasn't heaven's intervention. It was humanity's perception shifting. The tomb, once a symbol of finality, became a mirror, showing that what we fear most, death, loss, the end, is merely transformation. The body dies. The truth does not. Love cannot decay. Consciousness cannot be confined. What rose on that third day was not just Jesus. It was the birth of humanity's remembrance. Mary Magdalene was the first to sense it. The morning mist clung to her as she approached the tomb, her heart hollow, her mind a storm of disbelief. she expected silence. Instead, she found the universe whispering through the dawn. The light hit the stone just so, and for a moment she felt him not beside her, but within her. When she turned and saw the figure standing behind her, she did not recognize him by form or feature. She recognized him by vibration. "Do not cling to me," he said, "for I am not of this world." The words were not rejection, they were initiation. Humanity was being invited to see beyond eyes of flesh, to perceive through the Spirit, and so began the quiet revolution. The disciples gathered in secret once more, but this time their fear was different. It was no longer the fear of men, it was the trembling awe of those who had touched eternity. They realized that his teachings were not instructions, they were blueprints for awakening. "Love one another as I have loved you" was not sentiment, it was the key to evolution. Love, in its purest form, rearranges reality. It dissolves separation, collapses duality, and reveals that God was never somewhere else. God was the awareness, perceiving all things. But even then, even with hearts aflame, they struggled to carry this truth into a world built on power and control. The empire was quick to twist the message, to turn a revelation into a religion. And while the memory of Jesus spread like wildfire, his true purpose began to blur. The church was born not from the ashes of faith, but from the fear of freedom. And yet, hidden in that paradox was the very design he foresaw. Because even in distortion, truth finds a way to survive. Like light passing through stained glass, it may bend, but it never breaks. For centuries to come, his name would be used to justify conquest, to sanctify hierarchy, to bless war. And yet, within the heart of every seeker, the whisper remained, "You are the continuation of what he began." His story did not end with resurrection. It began there, because resurrection was never meant to be a single event. It was meant to be a perpetual state of being. Every time a person forgives instead of condemns, every time compassion wins over judgment, every time someone remembers their own worth in the face of shame, the Christ awakens again. That was the truth hidden in plain sight. The one reason rarely spoken. Jesus did not come to start a religion. He came to end the need for one. His mission was to collapse the illusion of separation between God and humanity, to remind us that salvation is not a transaction, it is recognition. The divine was never above, it was within, and the cross, the tomb, the resurrection, these were not symbols of his suffering, but maps of our becoming. And so, the true story was not about a man who died and rose again. It was about consciousness remembering itself through the life of a man who refused to forget. That is why his name endures, not because of miracles, but because he awakened the miracle of being. Yet, even now, after 2,000 years, the question remains, have we truly understood? Or have we built temples to the very illusions he came to dismantle? The answer lies not in Scripture, but in the silence within Usta, same silence that once followed his final breath, because in that silence he still speaks. Time has a way of turning miracles into myths. Centuries have passed since his footsteps touched the earth, and yet, somewhere beneath the noise of ritual and the weight of doctrine, his whisper still moves like wind through the human soul. It calls not from cathedrals or sermons, but from the quiet corners of our own consciousness. asking the same question he asked long ago. Do you still not see? The truth was never lost. It was simply buried beneath the rubble of interpretation, waiting for those willing to dig deep enough to find it. Because the true purpose of Jesus was never to create followers, it was to create mirrors. Each of us, a reflection of the divine consciousness that lived through him. His life was the blueprint, his death the unveiling, his resurrection the reminder that what we call God is not somewhere beyond the stars, but right here, pulsing in every breath, every heartbeat, every act of love that defies the logic of fear. He did not come to save humanity from sin. He came to awaken humanity from forgetfulness. But awakening is dangerous. It dissolves identity, unravels certainty, and tears down the walls we build to feel safe. To awaken is to die before dying, to lose everything you thought was you, so that what is truly eternal can rise. And that's why his message was never meant to be comfortable. It was meant to be transformative. Because real transformation doesn't happen in comfort, it happens in surrender. Imagine, for a moment, if the world truly lived by the consciousness he embodied. There would be no us and them, no wars fought in his name, no need for salvation, because no one would feel separated from the source to begin with. The beggar and the king would see themselves as reflections of one infinite being. Compassion would not be preached, it would be inevitable. Heaven would not be a destination, it would be recognized as the ever-present reality hidden beneath perception. That was the kingdom he spoke of. Not a golden city beyond the clouds, but the state of awareness in which love becomes law and unity becomes truth. When he said, "The kingdom of God is within you," he wasn't offering a metaphor, he was revealing the architecture of existence. And that single sentence, if understood, would render every religious hierarchy obsolete. Because once you realize that God is within, you stop searching for him without. This was the revolution he began, not through armies or crowns, but through consciousness. And that's why it terrified empires. Because once a human being knows their own divine nature, they become ungovernable by fear. They no longer worship power, they embody it. They no longer obey blind authority, they live in truth. That kind of awakening can't be controlled, it spreads like wildfire through hearts that are ready. And so, across ages and nations, through the rise and fall of civilizations, that fire has never gone out. It burns quietly in the mystics, the poets, the dreamers, who refuse to believe that separation is real. It flickers in the eyes of those who love without reason, who forgive when vengeance seems justified, who see the divine even in the broken. Every act of grace is a continuation of his mission. Every awakening is another resurrection. But here's the paradox: humanity still waits for his return, never realizing that he has already come back 1,000 times in every generation, in every soul that remembers what he remembered. The second coming is not an event, it's an emergence. It happens every time consciousness awakens within flesh and declares, "I and the Father are one." And that is the one reason you've never heard. Jesus didn't come to be worshipped. He came to be realized. His purpose was to ignite the eternal flame of awareness in each of us, to remind us that the divine is not a distant being, but the very essence of being itself. We are not fragments trying to find our way back to God. We are God exploring itself through the human experience. The crucifixion was the descent into illusion. The resurrection was the escape. And the invitation remains, will you awaken to? The world waits not for a Savior to descend from the sky, but for humanity to rise from its sleep. Every generation receives the same call, though few recognize its voice. It's not in thunder or fire, it's in the still small whisper that says, you are more than you think you are. The same voice that spoke through him now speaks through you. And when you finally listen, when you finally believe it not as an idea, but as truth, you will understand that his story was never meant to end on a cross. It was meant to begin in your heart. For the true purpose of Jesus was not redemption, it was remembrance. And remembrance, once it takes root, changes everything. So, if you have felt the pull, the quiet stirring in your soul, the sense that something ancient and infinite is trying to wake up within you, know this. It is not imagination. It is the same consciousness that moved mountains through him, now whispering through you. The story continues, and you are its next chapter. And when you understand that, you won't just speak of the light tool, become it. You won't just seek the divine, you'll remember that you've been divine all along, because that was the reason he came.